behind me. It's move-in day on CU campus. And so anyone in their right mind that's not moving in stays away from that place. It's an Australian artist named Ashley Wood, who cut his teeth in comic books and now kind of has his own. I see how some artists in the digital age are actually kind of early to the game in terms of creating a metaverse. So he has like comic book output, artistic output, makes figurines, and it wouldn't surprise me if animations are swiftly forthcoming. So I sometimes see artists who are creating a multimedia vision in which their characters live as one of the protean components of the metaverse. So just as I dork out on governance, I dork out on art.
I don't want to hold you up, so I think you can start whenever you're
okay.
ready.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm really appreciative of being here. Part of what I love about working at the intersection of digital governance and analog governance is never in a million years would I have imagined when 10 years ago I was advising constitutional reform processes and peace negotiations that the governance insights derivative from that experience would actually become highly relevant for figuring out how to govern distributed networked organizations like blockchain networks. And so talk about the ways in which this crazy world can surprise you. This is definitely one of those, but increasingly one of the sort of most vibrant verticals of my scholarship is in digital governance, applying traditional governance lessons to digitally networked organizations. What is one of the coolest forms of digitally networked organizations out there? Blockchain, but I probably don't need to sell any of those beneficial features to you all. Instead, a lot of my arguments surround kind of how traditional governance challenges tend to propagate even in systems of distributed governance like blockchain. And so my talk today has a series of insights that I've either published or are soon forthcoming, and I'm happy to provide links. It's likely that this talk will eventually become a blog post or a short article, but I'll be referencing a variety of pieces and definitely can provide those links to those interested. But the first insight I want to start with seems obvious, but it's worth belaboring because it is the fundamental starting point from which most of my points derive, and it's inescapable for answering the questions or governance challenges that I pose. It's that of an organizing purpose. And the fact is, an organization's chosen purpose is what causes it to constitute in the first instance. Think the set of activities that a DAO is organizing around. And frankly, I view the, Bitcoin and Ethereum networks as kind of the original DAOs. It's interesting that they call it, or on the Ethereum network, they call a DAO as an organization subsidiary to that's facilitated by smart contracts. But both the Ethereum and Bitcoin networks can be understood as a digitally networked organization constituted to pursue a particular purpose. Bitcoin forms and says, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we had a digital financial instrument that behaved a lot like cash? And the extent to which it does so is certainly open to debate in terms of transaction fees and transaction times, but it is one heck of a store of value these days, notwithstanding the market crash earlier this year. The Ethereum network forms and says, hey, Bitcoin, cool design. You resolve some interesting incentive problems among pseudonymous participants on a digital network, but we think you can do more with a transactional layer. With a thicker transactional layer, couldn't we encode the bylaws and processes of an entire organization? And so each of those is an animating purpose that causes people to gel around a particular governance structure. In each of those cases, the governance structure is the blockchain network. But this is not something specific to blockchain. All organizations that constitute themselves have a shared purpose. And that shared purpose, and this is kind of my first fundamental point, and it also concludes my talk, is that a given shared purpose will determine the optimality of a given organizational hierarchy. There are many things that I think distributed governance facilitated by blockchain technology, there are many organizational purposes that I think that technology will be transformative for. But there are just as many organizational purposes that I don't think the blockchain is particularly well suited to facilitating. So to me, the first question in governance design, and that's what I see as a lot of the exciting stuff going on blockchain networks or on subsidiary blockchain networks, is governance design. The first critical question is, what is the animating purpose of this particular organization? And ultimately, another way I make this point to my students is there are contexts where I don't want active participation in the governance of an organization, even though that organization implicates my interests at a deep structural level. What is the example I use to motivate that for my finance students here at CU Boulder? Well, diversification of my retirement accounts requires that they're vested in many, many different places. Municipal bonds, government bonds abroad, private equities. And yes, I have a small holding of cryptocurrencies, although nowhere near my traditional retirement accounts. Some of that's path dependence, which is it's locked in an IRA or a 401k with penalties. But at the end of the day, there are benefits resultant from a highly diversified investment portfolio that exceed the fact that I'm paying, investment managers with the firms that manage my Roth and my 401k. My value that I hope to draw upon to support myself, my wife, and my family in my retirement is diversified into so many companies, I couldn't actively govern all of those companies. That's just a simple fact. And so there are costs associated with the fact that I'm not directly engaged in governance. And many in blockchain communities focus on those, but I'm getting a benefit, which is a level of diversification that outstrips my ability to engage actively in the governance of those organizations. But to put it more in context here, when might allocation of community funds, say a public purse for a given DAO, these are community development funds, and they shall be allocated for these purposes in this particular DAO, when might that not map well to one token, one vote? And this is an area that I've been advising several DAOs through my work with Block Science, which is a consultancy firm based in Manhattan. Because in certain contexts, if the community resources being dispersed are greater than the cost of gaining control of the dispersal apparatus, you've just set up a great mechanism for take the money and run based on those who can buy enough tokens to control the vote about allocation of community funds. And so certain purposes might not be as tractable to one token, one vote as other purposes. And so the first high-level lesson that I kind of emphasize is, what does your purpose mean for optimal governance arrangements? A university is governed in a much more decentralized way than a sports team. And this is a point I make in an NBER working paper from 2021 called Leadership Within Organizations. But it's arguing purpose defines the optimal organizational hierarchy at a deep structural level. So start with the animating purpose that you are organizing your governance system around. Chances are for this audience, it'll probably be a distributed network form of governance, but there are many, many design choices within that, some of which I'll now continue to. So the second point is, to me, less obvious, which is, if you organize around a shared purpose, that's a very kind of heartening feeling. It's kind of a kumbaya moment, as I like to call it sometimes, which is to say, wow, isn't the thing we've organized to do, isn't that cool? We're here, we've identified this gap, we have this new technology that is well suited to providing credible and transparent governance around us. And effectively, this is, you know, this is a moment that is inherently kind of sort of one that is like, I call it a kumbaya moment. We all agree. By definition, we have to agree on an animating purpose in order for us to organize ourselves into a formal collective action apparatus using what I call a constitution. My first publication in this space, though, is arguing blockchains are a form of a constitution for the networks that they govern. And so when you constitute a distributed network, that's when you're launching the blockchain. And like all constitutions, blockchains require updates, which is a point I will return to in a moment. But there's a paradox inherent to declaring an animating purpose and then organizing a group around that animating purpose using a constitution, or in this case, a blockchain network. Which is to say, a purpose is unifying, but governance is not. That's why my second point is governance is conflict. Shared values are necessary to sufficiently create the basis for constituting an organization. But once you constitute an organization, conflict is inevitable. And it's easy to miss out on this fact when you're in the very moment of constituting, because again, it's this area where you're like, we all agree on this. Isn't this cool? We want to do this cool thing together. But the moment you create the constitutive rules for an organization, something flips, and it flips aggressively, which makes conflict resolution integral to understanding how governance systems work and are resilient over time. This is because constituting shared values has two structural implications that are unavoidable. And I just found out yesterday, the piece that I make these points in was accepted at MIT's Computational Law Report. And so that'll be coming out this fall. It's entitled Governance as Conflict, Constituting Shared Values as Defining the Future Margins of Disagreement. There are two reasons this proceeds structurally in every single collective action organization at impersonal scale. And what's cool about blockchain networks is they're kind of impersonal. You do not need to know personally all the individuals working on those networks in order for them to function. That's the pseudonymity, that's the confidence we have in blockchain network rules that replaces for our trust in humans we know. But what are these two things that make conflict inevitable? First, there is always going to be heterogeneity among organization members. This creates a constitutional political economy. The moment you constitute an organization, people's interests are relatively fixed within that constitutional structure. But given that change is inevitable, and I'll come to that point next, given that change is inevitable, this implicates different organization members' interests differently. Think about debates over protocol updates on a given cryptocurrency network. Some people support them, some people oppose them, often as a function of their existing interests, beliefs, and preferences within that particular network. So this means all change within constituted organizations creates winners and losers. So that means responding to a need to update the rules or make a collective decision inherently tends to provoke conflict. Our decisions in our Congress in the United States, are those conflict-free? Is the obvious thing to do just, apparent and agreed upon by all members? Of course not. And this is not to argue that Congress is working well. This is to argue that in all collective action organizations above a certain scale, there's going to be conflict about how to proceed. But it's far more structural than that, which is to say, there are some decisions about how the organization should proceed where there is near unanimity or total agreement about what everyone should be doing. That is the last issue that actually has to rise to the surface for a particular governance apparatus, which is to say, if every last organization member says, yeah, that's exactly what we need to be doing, and I have to do this in order for that to happen. And I totally agree. That's what we should be doing. If every organization member is in that position, that is the last issue that your governance apparatus needs to resolve. In contrast, the more disagreement approaches 50-50, or a similarly contentious subset of plurally competing interests, if the decision is non-binary, the more the governance apparatus needs to deal with the issue, needs to confront it under a set of processes that I'll also be describing characteristics of in a moment. And so these two structural facts make conflict resolution inevitable for collective action organizations above a certain scale. And digitally networked organizations are no different. But does this mean just conflict is just going to erupt? No, the purpose of a governance apparatus is to constrain conflict to occur through less destructive collective decision-making processes, as opposed to a winner-takes-all dynamic where the losers just exit the system or are just silently sitting there angry if they can't exit. Think of public governance systems and the losers of winner-take-all electoral conflicts. And so this is hard. Constraining conflict to occur through these collective decision-making processes is hard. But a few lessons have emerged. And a lot of this depends, again, on the chosen organizational context and its animating purpose. So I suspect some of the questions on our discussion section will be, you made this point at a general level, but what does this mean for this particular context that I'm operating in? Definitely happy to get into that. I'm just laying out kind of core governance principles in this discussion. First of all, you've got to have clearly specified decision rules for major decisions of import for a particular network. Otherwise, this creates a recursive problem. And this is the very reason that constitutions are argued to have emerged in the first place. If we have a group and we come together to make a decision and we don't define the decision rule ex ante, and I'm predicting I'm going to be in the losing set of the group after a few rounds of discussion, and implicitly the decision rule is simple majority. And I'm watching the discussion and I say, oh, I don't think I'm going to prevail if the decision rule is simple majority. I'm going to change the discussion in a highly unproductive way and say, guys, we haven't even defined a decision rule yet. This particular decision is so important, we need a super majority. Therefore, knowing if my opposition on this particular decision can't get a super majority, I've implicitly won. And so the very reason we have what are called secondary rules or constitutions is to lay down decision-making processes to productively channel conflict to a particular issue at hand. But you can't productively channel that conflict, those competing interests, until you've defined a decision rule clearly, because otherwise it creates the strategic incentives to assault the decision rule the moment you think you're going to lose under whatever the implicit decision rule is that hasn't been announced. Second, you need a certain level of transparency. And I call this imperfect transparency. I think that there's definitely a correct love of transparency on blockchain networks, but there seems to be an odd belief that everything can be transparent. To me, if it's humans making decisions, they'll always have a Slack channel you can't see. They'll always have a Signal or a Telegram message, or just the quintessential smoke-filled room where they get together at a bar and have a private conversation. I don't think those private conversations are actually necessarily bad. And the example I use to motivate this to my students is, can you imagine being on a jury over a sensitive or, serious criminal activity that occurred in your community? If you're told all jury deliberations are public and recorded and your vote will be recorded, I would stay completely silent during those jury deliberations and would probably vote alongside the community if there was any chance of retribution for taking the unpopular stance. But that's pretty antithetical to adjudicating whether or not someone is guilty in the first instance. That means sensitive community decisions likely to provoke conflict, should benefit from some measure of free, untrammeled discussion among those with the authority to make the decision. And if those with the authority to make the decision know that every last word they're speaking has been recorded, well, then deliberations become performative. And the true deliberations occur in the Slack channel, in the Telegram message, or in the smoke-filled bar. Although I'm thankful smoking's gone away to where that analogy sounds a little weird these days. But I think you get the point. That being said, though, when it comes time for a vote to be cast about the allocation of a DAO's funds for a particular community purpose by that DAO's stewards, I think that vote should be transparent. And perhaps the reasons, once frank deliberation has occurred among the stewards, perhaps those reasons should be required once they've actually gelled on to the set of reasons that animate their decision. But believing that all deliberations should be transparent is, to me, taking transparency too far, and it's avoiding the very reality that this stuff is all about conflict, and that sometimes means sensitive issues that people need to be able to debate in good faith. Think back to the jury example. Finally, and I'll return to this point as well, another quintessential characteristic of a transparent governance process that gives people good faith that their interests will be heard and that they'll understand the way in which collective decisions are being made in a given community is constraints on the executive authority of anyone especially empowered in governance. And I'll contend 2 points down that especially empowering people in governance is almost unavoidable in most collective actions at scale due to two fundamental institutions. One is the need to apply or interpret rules, and the other is simply that it's efficient to have some people making decisions on behalf of a larger whole. But I'll come back to that. But in terms of characteristics that constrain conflict productively to a specific space and give all members of an organization a certain level of faith, aka they believe the organization has legitimacy, these processes are clearly specified decision rules. Transparency as to the decision that is made, and perhaps the reasons that are justifying that decision, even if all debates shouldn't be fundamentally transparent. And finally, constraining those especially empowered to govern within the system. These are all essential kind of institutional design lessons. The discussion thus far, though, makes it sound like this is easy. We just think through these hard questions ex ante, and we can perfectly define the governance system for all time. And there's something about defining the action space of digital agents in protocol that makes that fallacy especially seductive to protocol designers, which is to say, wow, if we can just think through the action space, the relevant action space of all participants on this network, we can encode for all time the perfect constitution. I declare shenanigans. All protocols need updating because of changing circumstances. And so in traditional analog governance, this is known as institutional incompleteness, or the inevitability of change. But paradoxically, it's actually the stuff you don't encode, the stuff you can't institutionalize from the community surrounding the actual organization. So an organization is constituted of a set of individuals. That set of individuals is the community. The organization says you're a member if X, Y, and Z is true. These are your rights, these are your duties, and these are the rules that govern you. But the community surrounding an organization has a deeper set of values, preferences, and beliefs about governance that can never be fully constituted, whether into institutions in the real world or into protocol if we're talking about digitally networked organizations. Those protocols, just like all real world institutions, are inevitably incomplete. In those contexts where the incompleteness binds is where community values will substitute for formally defined institutions. So rule articulation by collective choice organizations requires foresight. By definition, you're thinking through the action space of participants on a particular network. But change springs eternal as organizations' members, circumstances, competitors, and even purposes change over time. And guess what? Our foresight is imperfect as before the myriad downstream contingencies that individual human behavior within rule-based organizations can generate. This means we cannot foresee everything relevant within the action space of members of a given digitally networked organization. More structurally, this means our organization's rules will never cover the full scope of behavior that emerges within their governance. But here's where the paradox really binds, which is it is the circumstances that institutional designers, those constituting an organization for the first time, those starting a DAO from, day one, from the Genesis block, so to speak, it is the circumstances that those designers cannot foresee that will determine whether their governance system will be viewed as legitimate. This makes the governance preferences, the norms and shared values of the community that the network is organizing, a fundamental input precisely at these times. And I'm actually working on a piece with Primavera de Filippi, Morshid Manin, Vessel Ryers. I call them the European contingent because they're a bunch of European blockchain governance scholars. But our piece is exploring the fraught relationship between, in US constitutional scholarship, what's called the Big C Constitution and the Little C Constitution, the set of values, norms, governance beliefs that constitutes the formal governance apparatus. On the European continent, this distinction is more frequently called the distinction between the material constitution and the formal constitution if you're a Kelsenian constitutional scholar. But the point is, those values and perhaps a forum by which people can debate their vision for governance will be an input in times of true uncertainty. Knightian uncertainty is sometimes what it's called. Rules, when well designed by institutional designers, do well with known unknowns. There's a certain risk, we can say, if this risk materializes, the community will do X, Y, and Z according to this process and these expectations. That's comparatively easy. But for true resilience, for any organization, they need to be able to credibly confront unknown unknowns. But that's where the problem really binds. By definition, institutional designers cannot predict what isn't currently known. But then how does a community proceed when true uncertainty is realized for a particular organization? What are they drawing upon? It's the Little C Constitution. It's the set of norms and values within that particular community that is constituted by the formal constitution, or in the case of blockchain networks, by the blockchain itself. The argument being a blockchain constrains and incentivizes network participants to act faithfully with good intent on behalf of a much larger polity of network users. And so similarly, though, circumstances have emerged that blockchain network designers could not predict, whether it be a massive increase in scale in the use of the network or a simple bug in the code in the first DAO. What informed the schism that led to, punishing the DAO hackers or the emergence of Ethereum Classic? It was the fundamental values of that community, which actually varied at a sufficiently structural level that that network forked. Was it more important to be fully faithful to code? Or was it more important to do something that was technically within the capacity of network participants, the validator nodes, which was we can agree upon rolling back the blockchain? That was not encoded what people did in that situation. That was a function of the underlying values held by those with the power to make governance decisions on that network. In that case, it didn't result in agreement, but that is an example how, in times of true uncertainty, what you have institutionalized is unlikely to be or provide clear guidance as to how to proceed. That means at all times, protocol designers have to be considering both the protocol they're encoding, the action space of network participants that they're tightly delineating, as well as the animating values of the community. Do you see how a lot of this links back to animating purpose? Don't worry, my conclusion's all about that. So I've already woven a narrative about how rules matter and how existing rules are insufficient during periods of true uncertainty. Yet the rules of the system themselves are often revealed to be inefficient or suboptimal or insufficient during a particular crisis that no one could have predicted. This makes the way in which you change the rules another fundamental organizational design consideration. So you've got to think through amendment rules and the extent of entrenchment of these rules, and the fact that actually your amendment rule for your system is an expression of the very core of shared governance beliefs about how things should proceed. So a blockchain network is about constituting a set of rules that enable anonymous or untrusting network participants to have confidence in the code as opposed to trusting blindly in their counterparty or large intermediaries. But protocol updates happen with predictable regularity, even though some provoke far greater controversy and occasionally outright schism, as I've already alluded to, than others. So rule changes can be understood as kind of a form of constitutional amendment when they affect the processes of the governance system themselves at a structural level. Think about the upcoming merge on Ethereum. That is a massive, massive rule change. Why? Because it's actually amending the amendment rule of the network itself. They're saying right now, proof of work is the means by which network validators, network participants validate transactions and choose whether or not to accept rule changes. All of that is changing at a fundamental structural level with the impending merge. So governance systems also delineate fundamental principles animating collective constitution. Think the preamble of, our Constitution in the United States or in many constitutions worldwide, as well as fundamental rights of individuals within the system. Think of the Bill of Rights in the US Constitution. Changing these core aspects of governance also are like major amendments to the system. This makes the amendment rule, what it takes to change the things I've just listed, itself a fundamental design question. Think of the current debates over whether identity-based voting is preferable to voting through the accumulation of many tokens on a given network. This is literally saying we make decisions in this system through this rule. And on many blockchain networks, to me somewhat problematically, the same rule applies to changing the rules of the system itself. This brings me to the inverse of amendment, which is also a critical question for protocol designers, which is rule entrenchment. Shouldn't certain aspects of governance be harder to change than others? Should all network processes be subject to the same consensus mechanism, or is it possible to entrench certain aspects of network processes at a higher level? That is what a constitution is in a very traditional sense. Entrench your legislative decision-making rule so that if you're defining the rule as simple majority, it should be harder to change the decision rule than simple majority, because otherwise anyone can amend the Constitution at the same time as passing ordinary legislation. That creates fundamental instability and cycling. So you entrench certain core components of governance to make them more difficult to change, because this productively channels conflict into the collective decision-making apparatus, because participants know the rules that are governing that collective decision-making. So for designers of digitally networked organizations, this makes which rules can be changed and at what threshold of voting another essential design question in the realm of reforming rules. My title to this talk is Rules and Reform. You have to think carefully about the rules you're defining as a function of the purpose of a given organization. But if you just think about that, you've forgotten about incompleteness and the inevitability of the need to amend your fundamental rule set. These two things go hand in hand. If you're constituting an organization, you're simultaneously constituting an amendment rule to change those fundamental rules. Design options here abound, and I suspect we may get into some of them in the discussion section. But they're essentially the question of how entrenched a particular statement of principles or set of network processes are compared to other potential changes. Constitutions globally have unamendable provisions, subsets of provisions that are highly entrenched, and other subsets of provisions that are much easier to change. So one design option is, are all rules on a particular digitally networked organization subject to the same change processes, or are certain aspects of them constituted at a much more entrenched level? So amendment is literally the flip side of entrenchment. How entrenched a particular set of rules are is how easy or difficult they are to amend in practice. So, I've talked about the animating purpose. I've talked about the fact that you need transparent and process-based collective decision-making processes precisely because they're prone to conflict. What they do is productively channel conflict in ways that otherwise prevent exit or more destructive forms of subversive conflict within a particular organization, as well as the fact that these things are incomplete, which means you need to give attention to how these rules change themselves, aka amendment. Finally, though, in most complex, impersonal modern organizations that act at scale, so not everyone knows one another and can kind of suss out what the little c constitution, what the shared values are, the extent to which someone should be trusted. Above Dunbar's number, at an impersonal level of organization, you tend to see something else happen, which is some people have far more power in governance than others because they've been especially empowered to govern. This gives rise to the canonical, the inevitable, the unavoidable question of who watches the watchman. And so several of my publications deal with the margins on which human input to digitally networked organizations is unavoidable. And the animating purpose of the network will determine the nature of this human input because it's determining your optimal governance structure on many important margins. But it is likely that some forms of specialization and delegated representation are likely to be emergent. What's an obvious form of specialization? There are far more users of cryptocurrency networks than there are individuals capable of coding protocol updates for those networks. There is a much, much smaller core of, guess what? They're called core devs in many of these communities that have huge influence over the future trajectory of these networks whose market capitalization runs into the massive levels of economic significance. And so that specialization, those individuals wield considerable authority precisely because of the specialization required to code protocol updates. But similarly, anytime you have someone performing representative tasks on your behalf, that's the institution of delegated representation. That's me being willing to have other individuals manage my retirement funds because that permits a level of diversification of risk that would be unattainable if I actively managed every single one of my investments. And so we delegate representation to legislators. Executives that we elect are also representing people. And similarly, judges are performing a special duty, but theirs is one of rule enforcement in particular. Many digitally networked organizations deliberately avoid ex post adjudication of rules, and I think in many contexts, rightly so. But the more complex a given digitally networked organization's purpose, the more likely you're going to need some form of ex post human intervention to reconcile edge cases that don't fit well with the intended purposes of the organization, even though they strictly follow from rule application. And so all of these sort of different forms of concentration of governance authority mean how you select and how you constrain those specially empowered is another critical design question for digitally networked organizations, just like meat space organizations, as they're sometimes called. What's the way to remind yourself of this? Who watches the watchmen? If the watchmen are empowered to watch over everyone, that means they have a heck of a lot of power that they may be exercising in an unaccountable way. So, some forms of specialization and delegated representation are emergent in impersonal organizations at scale. Digitally networked organizations are no different because across human history, this has emerged in the governance of large-scale impersonal collective action organization. But this makes those specialists and delegated decision makers another essential institutional design question, because they are exercising concentrated authority relative to ordinary organization members. This means granular governance challenges surround the specific way in which governance authority is concentrated within an organization. Unsurprisingly, then, the way in which legislators, executives, and judges are selected, retained, compensated, and disciplined are all essential design questions. And if you want to get into those and the variance, the huge institutional variance in those questions in practice worldwide, we can definitely get into that in discussion. But guess what? It tends to follow from the organization's purpose, which will determine the type of governance authority that is concentrated, which will then determine the optimal selection, retention, compensation, and disciplinary procedures for those especially empowered to exercise that concentrated governance authority. While these functions don't all carry to digitally networked organizations, many blockchain networks don't have judges, and a lot of folks think that's a good thing. Any individual or group with which concentrated governance authority resides should be considered in light of these concerns. But beyond the way in which the specially empowered to govern organization members are selected and incentivized are distinct areas of governance activity where additional attention typically needs to be devoted. And I've written in particular in this context for DAOs. Most canonical of all these areas of exercise of concentrated governance authority, most canonical of these areas is probably the power of the public purse, or the ability to direct large amounts of publicly sourced money by a relatively small number of individuals. The granular ways in which this power can be constrained are beyond the scope of this talk, but I have written about this question recently in some detail with a few other governance scholars at Block Science, and it's called Applying the Lessons of Constitutional Public Finance to Token System Design. And so many DAOs that have a set of funds that are aggregated from the community and then are dispersed by a smaller number of community members, that's a quintessential constitutional public finance challenge. There are other substantive areas of exercise of concentrated governance authority that are definitely relevant, but I start with the canonical challenge of public finance, precisely because it emphasizes this fact clearly. So I've got 10 minutes left and only one topic left to cover. And this one's kind of a conclusion, and it's going to be recursive because this stuff is all endogenous. It's maddeningly recursive, and it should feel that way. I've identified a range of fundamental institutional choices for designers of digitally networked organization. Problem is, there's no one answer. This brings it right back to what is the animating purpose of a particular organization that you're designing. An organization's chosen purpose, as defined initially, will determine the first constitutional political economy in terms of the individuals and their alignment and divergence of interest in pursuit of the organization's chosen purpose. It'll determine those individuals who constitute the organization in a little c or material constitution sense. This isn't static, though, especially in organizations whose members can exit, like those on many blockchain networks. This means network users and participants are constantly reconstituting these networks through their governance choices in real time. Nonetheless, for those designing organizations in the first instance, or guiding young organizations through fundamental changes to their governance processes, these design questions are paramount. They are unavoidable and should be weighed in light of the network's intended outputs and the shared values animating the creation of the network in the first instance. And from this purpose, defined by shared values and animating vision, derives the need to constrain the inevitable conflict that will emerge within any complex organization, which makes transparent collective choice and dispute resolution mechanisms also fundamental. How do you productively channel the conflict of interest that will be inevitably internal to the constitutional political economy that you have created within your networked organization? But because our collective foresight can't foresee what it can't foresee by definition, and the unforeseeable emerges with positive probability, the governance values and preferences of the community a given network is organizing will be determinative of collective choice outcomes in times of true uncertainty, and therefore a direct input to that organization's resilience or fragility in the times it matters most. But if the only certainty is uncertain change, then the way in which rules can be changed is another central consideration, which makes the question of rule entrenchment and its many distinct design choices a central consideration for organization designers. And given this need for collective choice mechanisms and dispute resolution and individuals to decide in times of true uncertainty, even if it's just a democratic decision rule for the whole community that is organized by a particular constitution, given the need for these collective choice mechanisms, dispute resolution, decision-making in times of uncertainty, not to mention the need for specialization in complex governance environments, concentration of authority is a common phenomenon in governance across history. This makes how those especially empowered to govern are chosen, incentivized, procedurally and substantively constrained, a final canonical institutional design question for designers of digitally networked organizations. So in sum, start with the animating purpose and begin thinking through these fundamental design questions and how they map to that animating purpose for a given networked organization. That's all I got.